"He's nothing but a failure who's never done anything right in his life," my father declared loudly enough for the whole room to hear, pointing directly at her with a finger holding a glass of cheap champagne. I was leaning against the wall of the banquet hall in Richmond, Virginia, holding a glass of soda that tasted like syrup mixed with water, surrounded by plastic tables and rented folding chairs. Country music played on the borrowed sound system, and the crowd was excited by beer and supermarket wine. Then Dad raised his arm around Jessica, the 26-year-old daughter of his new wife, Patricia. She was beaming in a pink dress that was too tight for the occasion and a smug smile on her lips. "This one," he said proudly, "this is my real daughter. The successful executive who makes the family proud." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. That was never his style. Business had taught me patience, but I had been practicing it long before I signed my first business contract back in Austin, Texas. I simply placed my glass on the nearest table and said to the teenage waiter in a bow tie, "Just water, thank you." I went out to the parking lot. The sun was setting, the heat was rising from the asphalt, and the cicadas were singing in the trees. My name is Nathan Pierce, and at 42, I had just heard my own father call me a failure in front of 100 people at his wedding. I pulled up in my understated gray Audi A6 and took a deep breath. The smell of cut grass mingled with the cigarette smoke of a few veterans chatting near the door. They looked at me, then looked away. People never know what to do in moments like this. Inside, the laughter resumed. Someone turned up the music again. I could imagine Dad dancing awkwardly with Patricia, his new bride. I could imagine Jessica soaking up the compliments, telling anyone who would listen that she was vice president of operations at TechFlow Solutions. She wasn't lying. She just wasn't telling the rest. That TechFlow Solutions was a subsidiary of Pierce Industries. My company. That his name had crossed my desk last week in a report on irregularities in supplier contracts. That his rapid promotion was being investigated by the Internal Audit Department. But that wasn't for now. At that moment, all I could hear were his words echoing louder than the cicadas. "He's nothing but a failure. I am a man who built a company from scratch. A man who employs more than 3,000 people in 5 states. A man who has signed million-dollar contracts in boardrooms where executives 30 years his senior respected her. And yet, in that hall in front of neighbors, cousins, and church acquaintances, my father took every ounce of dignity I had earned and tried to reduce it all to my youthful struggles. What hurts most about humiliation isn't just the words. It's the way they hang in the air. The way people's eyes avoid his. The way they decide whether to applaud or remain silent. That silence weighs more than the insult. I thought about leaving. I thought about hitting the road and going back to Dallas, leaving this night behind. I thought about my briefcase still in the trunk from the meeting I had earlier in Houston. Armani suit, polished Italian shoes, a tie that cost more than the rent for the entire haul. I thought about my late mother, who used to tell me, "Nathan, you don't have to fight every fight. But the ones you choose to fight, fight with class." So I stood there in the parking lot longer than I should have, letting the cicadas fill the silence my father had created inside me. And I decided that when I went back inside, I wasn't going to fight dirty. I wasn't going to yell or confront the man who gave me half my blood. I was just going to be who I was. Nothing more, nothing less. But at that moment, the pain of those words, that silence in the ballroom, was where my story really began. If you're enjoying his story of overcoming adversity and don't want to miss what happens when the truth comes out, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what my father didn't know was that I had kept much more than hurt all these years. And when the truth finally came out, it would be impossible to ignore. I hardly slept that night. The motel room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale cigarettes, the kind that no air freshener can mask. I lay on the hard mattress, shoes still on, staring at the ceiling with moisture stains and listening to the trucks roaring by on the highway. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. My father's clear voice, "He's nothing but a failure who never did anything right in his life." You'd think a man my age, owner of a technology company valued at $200 million, would be more resilient. And in most ways, I am. I've faced investors who thought he didn't know what he was doing. I survived 3 economic crises that broke competitors. I stood tall when employees I considered family betrayed me for better offers. But it's the small-town words from his own blood that cut deeper than any business battle. Lying there, I thought about how it all began. Austin, Texas, the 1970s. A duplex house that swayed in the wind. an air conditioner that barely kept up with the kitchen in July. My mother, Linda, worked double shifts at a restaurant on 34th Street. She came home smelling of frying oil and coffee, her hair tied back, her shoes kicked off at the front door. She was small, but she had a backbone stronger than any man I've ever known. Dad wasn't around much. He had his air conditioning business, or at least the beginnings of one, but he was never consistent. Sometimes he'd show up in a Ford pickup truck, sometimes he'd disappear for weeks. When he did come home, he had a knack for turning a good day into a bad one with a word or two. He never showed up at a school play or a football game. I learned early on that if I wanted something, I would have to earn it myself. Delivering newspapers before dawn, folding copies with frozen fingers. In the summer, I mowed lawns, raked leaves, did anything that paid $2 an hour. My friends saved up for cassette tapes and BMX bikes. I saved up for a bus ticket away from here. At school, I kept quiet. I wasn't the smartest, but I was consistent. The teachers noticed. One of them, Mrs. Mitchell, wrote on his report card, "Nathan does what he says he will do." I didn't think much of it at the time, but later those words echoed. Mom did her best to shield me from Dad's worst moods, but you can't hide everything. He had a way of talking to her as if she were furniture instead of a person. I remember one night when I was about 13. He looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You'll never be more than her." He meant it as an insult. I took it as a compliment. The summer after high school, I watched friends pack for the University of Texas or get married too young. I had no ring, no scholarship, and zero patience. One afternoon, I walked into the recruiting office on Slide Road. The sergeant behind the desk looked at me over his mustache and asked, "Are you sure about this, little girl?" I was. I signed the papers. Mom cried that night, not because she didn't want me to go, but because she knew I needed to. She told him, "Nathan, if you want to get out, earn it." In August, I boarded a bus heading east. My suitcase was small. It contained Mom's pocket Bible and $50 in cash. I left everything else behind. I looked out the window as the Texas planes rolled by, and I promised myself that I would never again let anyone else decide his worth. The Army taught him discipline, but more importantly, it taught him systems. How processes work. How organizations grow or fail. How to lead people who don't want to be led. When I left at 24, I used the GI Bill to study systems engineering at Rice University. I worked part-time at an electronics store, repairing computers that most people didn't even know existed. It was in 1992 that I saw the future coming. The internet. Email. Systems that would connect the entire world. While his classmates talked about jobs at oil companies, I saved every penny to start his own technology consulting firm. Pierce Systems started in a rented garage in Houston. Me and two partners, used equipment, cold pizza for dinner. Our first contract was to install a network for an accounting firm. $250. 15 years later, we sold Pierce Systems to IBM for $80 million. But I didn't stop there. I took that money and built Pierce Industries. Investments in startups. Software development. Business consulting. Every year, it grew bigger. With each acquisition, I got stronger. TechFlow Solutions was one of the companies we bought 3 years ago. A small digital logistics firm in Richmond, Virginia. Good technology, weak management, huge potential. That's when I met Jessica Morrison. She was on the payroll as an operations analyst. 23 years old at the time, fresh out of Virginia Commonwealth University, eager to impress. Solid work, nothing exceptional. Then her mother married my father. Suddenly, Jessica began to rise through the ranks. Analyst to supervisor in 6 months. Supervisor to manager in a year. Manager to vice president of operations in 18 months. The human resources department raised red flags. Promotions too fast. Disproportionate salary increases. Supplier contracts approved without proper documentation. But Jessica had protection she didn't know existed. His stepfather was my father. And I didn't interfere in subsidiary operations unless it was absolutely necessary. Until it became necessary. Last week, the internal audit report crossed my desk. TechFlow Solutions. Irregularities in supplier contracts. Emergency approvals without justification. Payments to companies we couldn't verify. Jessica Morrison was the signature on all the documents. $67,000 in questionable contracts. Not enough to break the company, but enough to break a career. As I read the report in that office in Dallas, city lights flashing below, I thought about the coincidence. My father finally had his successful daughter. Her. Vice president. Someone to be proud of. Too bad she was about to lose it all. Lying in that motel room, air conditioning humming in the window, I thought of all the nights Mom stayed up sewing uniforms, counting tips, telling me I was worth more than my beginnings. I thought about the friends I buried, the medals stored in a box at home, the weight of the command I carried. And yet one sentence from a 78-year-old man in a cheap rented suit had managed to drag me back to 13 years old, sitting at that dinner table in Austin, Texas. I sat on the bed, rubbed my eyes, and whispered to myself, "You've earned every inch of her life, Nathan. Don't let him take that away." The trucks continued to pass by on the highway, and I sat there in the dim light, remembering the simple facts of a difficult childhood that had shaped me. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just remembered. And I started planning. Because what my father didn't know, what Jessica didn't know, was that I had kept much more than hurt all these years. I had kept documents, records, connections. And when the truth finally came out, it would be impossible to ignore. If you want to find out how this family and business story will unfold, and how a simple audit can change everything, stay tuned. Because in the business world, knowledge is power. And I was about to show everyone exactly how much power a failure can have. The invitation arrived 2 months earlier, in a beige envelope with his name misspelled. Nathan Whitaker. Dad never bothered to learn the small details. Even so, Aunt June called a week later and said, "Honey, it would be nice if he showed up, even if just to show his face." I wasn't planning on going. 42 years had taught me that some roads aren't worth traveling. But June was the only person who never turned his back on him. She was her aunt who slipped me money for lunch in high school, who drove me to the bus station when I left for the army, who called every Christmas no matter where I was. If she asked, I would show up. On the morning of the wedding, I was in Houston overseeing the signing of a $2 million contract. Armani suit, Italian shoes polished to a shine, a tie that cost more than the rent for the entire hall. When the meeting was over, I went back to the office, took off my gold cufflinks, and hung the suit on a hanger. For a moment, I thought about leaving it there, but something told him to put it in the trunk of the Audi. The trip to Richmond was nothing new, just the endless crawl of I-95, flashing brake lights, Cracker Barrel billboards, and car dealerships. I stopped at an Exxon station, grabbed a black coffee that tasted like burnt tires, and continued on. When I arrived at the American Legion parking lot, the sun was already low, painting the sky orange and purple. Pickup trucks, minivans, and a limousine that Denise must have rented were already parked outside. I didn't wear the suit inside. Instead, I put on a simple blue dress shirt and casual shoes. Nothing flashy. I didn't want eyes on me. It was Dad's day, not his. Let him enjoy it. Inside, the hall smelled of barbecue and cheap perfume. Plastic tablecloths stretched over rows of folding tables. A DJ set up in the corner was testing the speakers with a Conway Twitty song. Cousins I hadn't seen in 30 years whispered behind napkins. Some waved, others didn't. I nodded and kept walking. Patricia was radiant in a rhinestone dress that looked like it came straight out of a department store window. She hugged me awkwardly, all teeth and perfume. "Nathan," she said, her voice high-pitched. "I'm so glad you came." Jessica was next to her, her cheeks rosy with blush, already holding a glass of wine. I didn't stay at the table long. I grabbed a coffee in a styrofoam cup, stirred it even though there was nothing to stir, and sat at the back near the exit. That's when the toasts began. Dad stood up in front of everyone. His hair slicked back, his suit loose around his shoulders. He raised a glass of champagne and the room fell silent. "Family," he began, "is what makes a man proud." My chest tightened. For a second, I thought that maybe, just maybe, he was going to say something kind. But then he pointed right at me. "He's nothing but a failure who never did anything right in his life." The room froze. The forks stopped scraping. Aunt June sighed. "Hal, don't do this." He continued, his voice rising. "This one." He pulled Jessica closer. "This is my real daughter. The successful executive who makes the family proud. Jessica blushed and laughed as if she had been crowned prom queen. Patricia clapped her hands, proud as a peacock. And me? I just put his coffee aside, said to the bartender, "Just water, thank you," and left. The parking lot was still warm from the day, cicadas singing in the trees. I leaned against the Audi, looking at the suit in the trunk. That navy blue suit, heavy with medals and commendations, hanging there in silence. I had brought it out of habit, not intention. But now I wondered if perhaps fate had other plans. I stood outside longer than I should have, listening to laughter coming from the open doors. The people inside had decided how to deal with Dad's words. Some applauded, others looked away. Most remained silent. Silence can weigh heavier than insult. Mom used to say, "Nathan, you don't have to fight every fight, but the ones you choose, fight with class." I repeated that to myself, watching fireflies flicker over the grass. With class. Not loud, not ugly. With class. And in that parking lot, I realized I hadn't come to that wedding just for Aunt June. Deep down, part of me still hoped that he would finally see me. He didn't. But maybe it was time for everyone else to see. I went back inside after a while, trying to blend in with the wallpaper. The DJ had switched to George Strait, and couples were dancing the two-step on the linoleum floor. The air smelled of pulled pork, coleslaw, and sweet tea sweating in plastic cups. No one gave me a second glance. Most were caught up in the celebration. That's when I heard Patricia's voice rise above the music. She was standing with a circle of cousins, laughing loudly, her hand resting on Jessica's arm. "This is my daughter Jessica," she said proudly. "She's in the Marines, working at Quantico, no less." The cousins O and Ara, eyes widening. Jessica leaned into the conversation, wine glass swaying between her painted nails. "It's true," she said smiling. "Quantico is basically headquarters. I take care of important things. Everyone there knows him." I remained quiet, sipping water. My corporate life had taught me when to speak and when to remain silent. But the truth tickled my throat. I knew Jessica's name. She had crossed his desk last week. He was a corporal in administration, flagged for falsified travel receipts. Nothing that would end her career if she owned up and corrected it, but serious enough to need guidance. I didn't bring it up. Not at her mother's wedding. Not with all eyes watching. But the contrast gnawed at me. My father holding her up as the shining star, while I was nothing but a failure in his eyes. I moved closer, close enough to hear the details. Patricia boasted, "She's going places." Not everyone gets to be placed at Quantico. It shows the kind of talent she has. One of the cousins, old Bobby from Charlottesville, patted Jessica on the back. "Good job, little girl. Carry the family name with pride." Jessica smiled, chin up, soaking up every drop of attention. "Oh, I will. You'll see me with stripes soon, maybe even officer school." The room buzzed with approval. Meanwhile, I stood there, a two-star general unnoticed in my plain polo shirt. Aunt June approached, whispering, "Nathan, don't mind them. People don't know half of it." His eyes, soft and sad, sought mine. I just smiled thinly. "It's okay, June." But inside, something broke. It wasn't jealousy of Jessica's pride. She was young, hungry, perhaps reckless, but she was still military. What hurt was Dad's presumption, the way he used her as an accessory to overshadow me. Later, at the buffet table, I found myself next to Jessica. She was piling fried chicken onto her plate, talking non-stop with a friend. She turned, noticed me, and said, "Oh hi, you're Nathan, right? Dad's first son." I nodded. "That's right." Her friend asked, "So, are you in the military too?" Jessica smiled before I could answer. "No, he just does his thing out there." Then she winked at me as if we shared some private joke. I left my plate untouched. "Something like that," I said quietly and walked away. Back at my table, I stirred another cup of bad coffee, my hand steady even I thought about that counseling memo on my desk, the one with Jessica's name at the top. I thought about how the Marines don't care about family pride or wedding speeches. They care about truth, discipline, responsibility. And I thought about how Dad had called her her real daughter while dismissing me as less than nothing. I didn't blame Jessica. She was young, caught up in her mother's pride. But I knew that sooner or later she would learn what the core demanded. And it wasn't brilliant presentations in Legion halls. It was the kind of work that left you tired to the bone, steady and marked. I didn't want revenge against her. I didn't even want revenge against his dad. What I wanted was for the truth to prevail. And sometimes, the only way for the truth to prevail is to put it in front of everyone, plain and simple. That night, driving back to the motel, headlights stretching along Route 3, I kept replaying the scene in my head. Patricia boasting, his beaming, Jessica soaking it all in. I kept seeing the cape in his trunk, the 2 stars shining on the collar. He had chosen not to wear it. He had chosen silence. But silence, he realized, came at a price. And that night, as the cicadas sang and the trucks roared down the highway, he began to understand that maybe it was time to break that silence. If you want to see how this story of family and power unfolds, and find out what happens when the truth finally comes out, keep following this journey. Because in the business world, knowledge is power. And I was about to show exactly how much power a failure can have when he decides to no longer be invisible. The parking lot was almost empty when I left again. A few veterans leaned against the hood of a Dodge, smoking and swapping stories, her laughter spreading through the warm Virginia night. The air was thick with honeysuckle and a faint sourness of spilled beer. I walked past them, waved, and walked to my Audi. I leaned against the trunk, staring at the dark outline of the trees beyond the parking lot. I could still hear the thudding beat of the music inside. Someone had put on Amarillo by morning. My father's voice echoed in my head, louder than the bass. He's nothing but a failure who never did anything right in his life. I opened the trunk. The suit was laid out on the bottom, the zipper glinting in the dim light. I hadn't planned on wearing the suit again that day, but now it seemed to be waiting for me, patient and heavy. I ran my hand over the coat and swear I could feel the weight of every mile, every year, every grave I had respected. I took my phone out of my pocket, my thumb hovering over the contacts. One name stared back at me. Samuel Martinez, my CFO. I had worked with Martinez for 15 years, since Pierce Systems was still 3 guys in a rented garage. He had a way of reminding me what mattered. I pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "Nathan," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so late." I sighed, leaning against the car. "Sam, I'm at my father's wedding." He stood up in front of everyone and called me a failure. Then he introduced Jessica as her real daughter. Silence stretched out for a moment. Then Martinez laughed dryly, like dust. "He's still the same Hal, huh?" "Worse," I muttered. "What do you think?" Martinez's voice was firm. "Nathan, you earned every penny that is his. Every employee, every contract, every decision. Using that isn't petty. It's the truth." I closed my eyes and breathed in the humid night air. "I don't want to humiliate anyone." "Then don't," Martinez said simply. "But don't let a lie prevail either. His father can yell. Her stepmother can brag. But the company he built, no one can take that away from you. Let them see it. Let them know." We were silent for a while, only the buzzing of cicadas filling the gap. Finally, Martinez said, "Whatever you decide, Nathan, I know you'll do it with class." "With class," I echoed, remembering Mom's words. "Thanks, Sam." After he hung up, I stood there for a long time, listening to the night. A train whistle sounded somewhere in the distance, low and melancholy. I unzipped my coat. The smell of wool and starch hit me like the memory itself. Piece by piece, I put on the suit. Starched shirt, tight collar. Gold cufflinks I got on my 10th anniversary with the company. Italian silk tie that cost more than many people's monthly salary. I put on the jacket, buttoned it slowly, and slipped on the polished shoes that reflected the parking lot lights. Finally, I looked at myself in the side mirror. The man staring back at me wasn't just Nathan from Austin, Linda's son, discarded by Hal. He was Nathan Pierce, founder and CEO of Pierce Industries. A man who employed 3,000 people in 5 states. A man who had turned a rented garage into a $200 million empire. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my tie, and whispered to myself, "You didn't come here to win a scene. You came here to be real." With that, I closed the trunk and walked back to the hall, each step firm, steady, classy. As I approached the entrance, I heard familiar voices through the open door. Patricia was in the center of a group, gesturing animatedly. Jessica has so much potential, she was saying. Vice president at 26. Not every company recognizes talent that quickly. Aunt June was there too, standing slightly apart from the circle, her arms crossed. His eyes met mine through the glass door and widened. She saw him first. Then Bobby, the cousin from Charlottesville. Then Mrs. Henderson from church. One by one, heads turned. The hall was still bustling when I pushed open the door. A blast of air conditioning hit me, along with the twang of a violin from the DJ's speakers. People were laughing, clinking glasses, cutting cake. But when I crossed the threshold, the sound didn't just diminish, it died. I walked in, heels clicking against the linoleum floor, my navy suit gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Every pair of eyes followed me. One cousin murmured, "My God in heaven." Another whispered, "That suit must have cost more than my car." Chairs scraped as people turned to follow me with their eyes. Dad froze near the head table, Patricia's arm linked through his. His smile faltered, then hardened into something colder. Jessica was in the middle of a laugh when she saw me. At first, his eyes caught the cut of the jacket, the quality of the silk, the shine of the Italian shoes. Then his gaze moved up and she saw her face. The color drained from her. She took a step back, her hand trembling against his wine glass. "Oh my God," she stammered, her voice cracking loud enough for the entire room to hear. You're his boss." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I walked forward, each step measured. When I reached the head table, I turned to face the crowd. "I came here tonight to wish my father well," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I didn't come for speeches, and I didn't come for insults. I am who I am, and I worked for it." No one gave him anything. No one breathed. The DJ had cut the music, and even the ice machine seemed to have stopped humming. I turned slightly toward Jessica, who was frozen, her cheeks still pale. "Jessica will handle any business matters in the office. Not here." His lips parted, but no words came out. She nodded once, quickly and spasmodically. Then I raised my glass of water, to setting things right when we can. I took a slow sip, put the glass back on the table, and waited. It was Aunt June who broke the silence. "Nathan dear," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. She began to clap her hands. One by one, others joined in, hesitant at first, then louder. The veterans in the back sat up straight in their chairs, saluting firmly and proudly. A woman from the church dried her eyes with a napkin. Even the bartender, the boy in the bow-tie vest, stood straighter behind the counter. Dad didn't applaud. He just stood there, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. Patricia forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. But it didn't matter. The truth was standing there, clear for everyone to see, and there was no turning back. If you want to find out how this revelation will transform not only this night, but the entire family dynamic, keep following this journey of truth and consequences. Because in the world of business and families, sometimes the only way to earn respect is to show exactly who he really is. And I was about to find out if his family was ready for the whole truth. I didn't linger. I wasn't there to brag. I left the main table, walked across the room as the applause grew, and headed for the door. Every handshake, every wave, every whispered "Thank you, Mr. Pierce" was more than enough. Outside, the cicadas were still singing, the night still heavy with summer air. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt clean. But that was only the first part. The real test would come later, when the consequences of this night began to unfold. And Jessica would have to face not only the shame of discovering who he was, but the professional consequences of what he had done. The applause died down as I walked back inside. The music had stopped completely, and the entire hall watched him in absolute silence. But this time it wasn't the awkward silence of humiliation. It was the silence of recognition. Patricia was the first to recover, forcing a plastic smile as she approached. "Nathan, what a wonderful surprise to hear about his success," she said, her voice trembling as she tried to sound casual. But her eyes revealed pure panic. Jessica remained frozen near the cake table, the wine glass still trembling in her hands. I could see her mind working frantically, replaying every conversation we had, every boast she had made about her importance in the company. Dad finally moved, walking toward me with measured steps. When he got close, her voice came out low, almost a whisper. "Nathan, why didn't you tell me?" I looked him straight in the eye. "When, Dad?" Between calling me a failure and celebrating her real daughter. He recoiled as if he had been punched. That's when my phone rang. The display showed, "Martinez, urgent." "Excuse me," I said, answering in front of everyone. "Go ahead, Sam." "Nathan, we have a problem at TechFlow. The audit finished early. The numbers are worse than we thought." I looked at Jessica, who had moved close enough to hear. His eyes widened. "How much worse?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. 120,000 in fraudulent contracts. And there's evidence of supplier bribery. We're going to have to involve the FBI. Jessica dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor, red wine spreading like blood across the linoleum. "FBI," she whispered, her voice breaking. I ended the call and looked at her. "Jessica, I need you to come to the office first thing tomorrow morning. Bring a lawyer." Patricia interjected, desperate. "Wait, there must be some misunderstanding. Jessica is an exemplary employee. You himself said that." "I said she would handle business matters at the office," I interrupted. "And that's exactly what's going to happen." Dad finally understood the magnitude of the situation. "Nathan, she's family now. Surely we can work this out privately." Family. The word came out harsher than I intended. 20 minutes ago, he was a failure. Now that they've found out who he is, we're family. The room was completely silent. Even the cicadas outside seemed to have stopped chirping. Jessica began to cry. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who he was. If I had known, I would never have." "Never have what?" I asked calmly. "Falsified receipts? Approved overpriced contracts? Accepted bribes from suppliers?" Each word was like a slap in the face. She bent over, sobbing. Patricia tried one last gambit. "Nathan, please. She's young. She made mistakes. But destroying her life won't do anyone any good." "I'm not destroying her life," I replied. "I'm protecting my company and 3,000 honest employees. Jessica made her choices. Now she'll face the consequences." That's when Aunt June approached me, touching my arm gently. "Nathan dear," she said softly, "you have every right to be angry. But this girl, she seems genuinely remorseful." I looked at Jessica, bent over and crying, then at Patricia, desperate, then at his father, who seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Remorse doesn't undo the crime," I said. "But maybe it will prevent it from happening again." I turned to face the entire room. Cousins, neighbors, people from church, veterans. They all looked at me with a mixture of respect and caution. "I didn't come here to ruin a wedding," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I came to wish my father happiness. But I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not to make you feel comfortable." I walked over to Jessica and crouched down to her eye level. "You have real talent," I said softly. "I saw his work before the rapid promotions. It was solid. Honest. What happened to that?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I wanted to impress. I wanted Mom to be proud. I wanted to prove I deserved to be there." "You deserve to be there," I replied. "For his work, not for the shortcuts." I stood up and looked around the room once more. "The truth is simple," I announced. "I've spent 40 years building something from the ground up. Jobs, careers, families depend on the decisions he makes. I cannot and will not compromise that for family convenience." Patricia stepped forward, defiant for the first time that evening. "What if we don't cooperate? What if we don't let you destroy my daughter?" I smiled coldly. "Mrs. Pierce, this doesn't depend on her cooperation. The audit is already over. The documents are already with our legal department. The FBI has already been notified." I turned to my father. "You wanted a successful daughter to be proud of. Congratulations. You got one who will be prosecuted for federal crimes." Dad opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. "Nathan," Jessica pleaded, tugging at his jacket sleeve. "Please. I'll pay it all back. I'll do anything. Just don't turn me over to the FBI. I looked at her for a long moment. The money has already been automatically returned by the company's insurance. And as for the FBI, that was out of my hands the moment you signed those contracts. The truth was, I still had some influence over how the case would be handled. I could ensure that Jessica cooperated in exchange for a lighter sentence. I could structure her dismissal to minimize damage to her future career. But they didn't need to know that yet. I glanced at my watch. The wedding isn't over yet. You should enjoy the party. I walked toward the exit, each step echoing in the total silence. At the door, I turned one last time. Dad, congratulations on the wedding. I hope that his two will be very happy together. And I left, leaving an entire hall processing what they had just witnessed. Outside, the warm night air felt less oppressive. The cicadas had resumed their song, and the sky was clear, full of stars. I leaned against the Audi and took a deep breath. My phone rang again. Martinez. How did it go? He asked. Educational, I replied. For everyone involved. And now? I looked at the hall through the windows. I could see people moving slowly, whispering to each other, still processing. Now we'll see if he's learned anything. Because the real lesson was yet to come. And when the sun rose the next day, the lives of everyone inside would be different forever. What they didn't know yet was that I had one last surprise in store. One that would transform not only Jessica, but the entire dynamic of our dysfunctional family. And this time, there would be no turning back. 3 months had passed since that night at the American Legion Hall. Jessica cooperated fully with the investigation, returned every penny from the fraudulent contracts, and accepted a 2-year suspension from the industry. In return, she avoided jail time and kept a clean record to restart her career. The last time we spoke, she said, "Mr. Pierce, thank you for giving me a second chance I didn't deserve." Everyone deserves to grow from their mistakes, I replied. Use this opportunity well. Patricia never mentioned Jessica's accomplishments again. In fact, she barely spoke to me on the few family occasions she attended. And Dad? 2 weeks ago, I got an unexpected call from his. Nathan, there's an awards ceremony at the Chamber of Commerce on Thursday. Will you be there? I was. Pierce Industries had won the Company of the Year award. When I went up on stage to accept the trophy, I looked for familiar faces in the audience. There he was, in the 3rd row, standing and applauding. After the ceremony, he approached me with Patricia at his side. Nathan, he said, his voice firm but respectful. This is my son, Nathan Pierce, CEO of Pierce Industries. Not half-son. Not first attempt. My son, his. The words were simple, almost awkward, but they were real, and they landed somewhere deep, heavier than any insult ever had. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just held out my hand and said, "Thank you, Dad." Driving home that night, windows open on I-95, I thought about the entire journey. From rejected kid in Austin to respected CEO. From failure in his father's eyes to a man he could finally call his son. The truth about family isn't about who shouts the loudest at a wedding toast. Family is about who shows up, even late, even awkward, but honest. And dignity? It doesn't need an audience. But sometimes an audience needs to see dignity to remember what she looks like. I learned that carrying insults is like carrying rocks. You get heavier with every mile. But when you finally let them go, it's not just relief you feel. It's the memory of what it was like to walk light. If this story of overcoming and redemption touched his life, subscribe to Twist and Revenge for more stories about how the truth always finds its way to the light. Sometimes the greatest power isn't in proving others wrong. It's in knowing who he is, regardless of what they think. Last week, I opened my 5th Pierce Industries branch. Dad cut the ribbon at the grand opening. Jessica? I heard he went back to college, studying ethical business management. Sometimes the most necessary falls are the ones that teach us how to truly fly.